just above the surface of the Pacific, where the sea stretched out, calm and deceptively endless. A twin-engine silhouette came tearing in at barely mast height. From the deck of a Japanese transport, sailors shaded their eyes against the glare, expecting the usual pattern, perhaps a high-altitude bomber circling far above, or the distant whine of dive planes rolling into their attack. That was the rhythm of naval war. That was what they had trained for. But this aircraft did not climb. It did not peel away. It kept coming low, fast, unwavering, so low it seemed to skim the waves themselves. Then the nose flashed. 8.50 caliber machine guns erupted in a single concussive burst. Tracers tore forward, stitching a burning seam across steel decks and exposed gun crews. In a matter of seconds, anti-aircraft mounts were ripped apart, bridges splintered under concentrated fire, signal stations shattered. Men who had been scanning the horizon were suddenly diving for cover, scrambling over hot metal, slick with oil and blood. This was not a torpedo run. There was no graceful dive from the sun, no bomb whistling down from altitude. This was something far more savage. A medium bomber, designed to be a ship killer, had just remade itself into a flying buzzsaw. By 1943, Japanese convoys moving through the Southwest Pacific would learn to recognize a new sound. Not the distant rumble of engines high above, but the growing thunder of forward-firing guns from a heavily modified North American B-25 Mitchell. Japan had prepared for bombs falling from the stratosphere. It had drilled crews to counter torpedoes skimming across the waves, but it had not prepared for an aircraft that would come straight at a ship's face and rake it from bow to stern methodically, relentlessly cutting it open with sustained, concentrated fire. To understand how that transformation took place, you have to step back to the strategic shock that reshaped the Pacific. After the devastating strike at the attack on Pearl Harbor, Imperial Japan surged outward with breathtaking speed. The Philippines, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, long chains of islands scattered across blue emptiness one after another, fell under Japanese control. With every conquest, Tokyo stretched a fragile web of supply lines across thousands of miles of open ocean. Troops moved by transport, ammunition, and aviation fuel followed. Food, spare parts, construction material. Everything that sustained Japan's expanding empire traveled by ship. Convoys became the arteries of the war effort. And as any soldier knows, if you sever the arteries, the body begins to bleed. Yet, early in the war, striking those arteries was no simple matter for the United States. Aircraft carriers were scarce and precious. Forward bases were distant, often hacked out of jungle and coral, crude strips carved from unforgiving terrain. The Pacific was not Europe. It was vast beyond easy comprehension of battlefield measured in horizons, where targets were separated by endless water and islands that looked like specks on a map. The U.S. needed aircraft that could endure punishment, adapt to rough conditions, and fly from short, improvised runways. The B-25 Mitchell fit that need. Designed as a medium bomber for level bombing, it carried a solid bomb load, mounted defensive guns for protection, and operated from relatively short strips. It proved its boldness early on when modified versions lifted from the deck of the USS Hornet during the famous Doolittle raid, striking Tokyo and delivering a psychological blow that echoed far beyond the physical damage. Still, versatility was not the same as specialization. The B-25 had not been conceived as a dedicated anti-shipping predator. High-altitude bombing against maneuvering ships turned out to be maddeningly ineffective. Japanese captains threw their helms hard over the moment bombers appeared overhead. Even near misses often failed to cripple a vessel outright. Torpedo aircraft were deadly but fragile, flying straight and low into walls of defensive fire. Dive bombers demanded precision timing, clear weather, and favorable angles. The brutal truth was unavoidable. To reliably sink ships, Allied airmen would have to get closer and comfortably, dangerously close. In the vast Pacific theater, innovation did not come only from assembly lines back home. It grew from forward airfields, where pilots and mechanics studied the enemy each day and asked hard questions at night. Out of that necessity came a radical reimagining of the B-25's role. Instead of dropping destruction from altitude, it would charge forward at wave height, engines straining, guns blazing. And when those 8 heavy machine guns spoke together, steady, hammering, merciless, they turned an ordinary medium bomber into one of the most feared ship killers of the Pacific War. When the North American B-25 Mitchell first rolled off the line and entered service, no one spoke of it as a terror of the seas. It wasn't built for that reputation. It was, by design, a practical, well-balanced, medium bomber, twin engines, humming in steady harmony. A respectable mid-range bomb load tucked into its belly, defensive gun positions bristling along the fuselage, and that familiar glazed nose where a bombardier crouched over his sights, guiding bombs toward distant targets. Named for the outspoken air power advocate Billy Mitchell, the aircraft carried forward his conviction that aviation would reshape modern war. But in truth, like most bombers of its generation, it was conceived around a straightforward doctrine: climb to altitude, hold formation, steady the ship. Release your bombs over airfields, depots, rail yards, or troop concentrations, and then turn for home, clean, ordered, predictable, at least on paper. Then came the Pacific. Early in World War II, that neat doctrine collided with the harsh, sprawling realities of an oceanic battlefield. The distances were staggering. Targets moved. Weather shifted without warning. Japanese transports and warships didn't sit still beneath a bombing run. They maneuvered hard, throwing wakes across open water as soon as they sensed danger. From 10,000 feet or more, even experienced bombardiers struggled to score consistent hits on ships weaving and turning below. A bomb that missed by a handful of yards might as well have fallen a mile away, swallowed uselessly by the sea. For B-25 crews, the frustration was real and immediate. They had speed, they had range, they had nerve. What they did not have was a dependable way to cripple ships and keep them from delivering men and supplies to the next contested island. The airplane did reveal its adaptability early on. In April 1942, specially modified B-25s clawed their way off the deck of the USS Hornet during the daring Doolittle raid. It was a gamble that bordered on reckless medium bombers lifting from a carrier deck. The physical damage inflicted on Japan was limited, but the psychological shock traveled far. The mission proved something important. The B-25 could operate beyond conventional boundaries. It could be altered. It could surprise. It could strike in ways the enemy had not prepared for. Even so, its primary identity remained intact. It was still, at heart, a medium bomber. In the Southwest Pacific, under commanders who demanded measurable results, the B-25 was thrown into nearly every role imaginable. It attacked airstrips carved from jungle clearings. It strafed supply dumps. It flew close air support for ground troops, hacking their way through mud and tangled undergrowth. Crews operated from primitive strips, hacked out of coral and clay. Maintenance teams improvised repairs with limited spare parts, often cannibalizing one aircraft to keep another flying. The Mitchell earned a reputation for toughness. It could take punishment, come home riddled with holes, and still protect its crew. But when Japanese convoys pushed reinforcements toward distant garrisons, the limitations of high-level bombing grew harder to ignore. The problem at its core was accuracy under fire. Ships were not static factories or motionless runways. They were alert, defended, and quick to react. Japanese anti-aircraft gunners had clean firing arcs against bombers approaching from above. Even near misses frequently failed to deliver decisive damage to transports built to survive heavy seas. Allied airmen began experimenting with lower altitude attacks. They found that getting closer improved the odds of a hit, but it also brought them face to face with concentrated defensive fire. As losses mounted and Japanese supply convoys continued sustaining the Empire's reach, urgency replaced patience. The B-25, rugged and adaptable, became the center of that urgency. If bombs falling from altitude could not reliably stop ships, perhaps the answer wasn't altitude at all. Perhaps it was boldness. Perhaps it was aggression. The transformation would not start in a distant design office. It would begin out on forward bases, among crews who had watched their bombs splash harmlessly into the sea, and who were willing to ask a dangerous, almost heretical question. What if we stop bombing from above and start attacking head? The transformation of the B-25 from a conventional medium bomber into a low-level attack predator didn't come out of tidy planning rooms in Washington. It wasn't drafted neatly on a blueprint far from the front. It took shape under corrugated tin roofs and open skies, in the sweltering heat and wet, choking humidity of forward Pacific airfields. Crews who had watched their bombs fall wide from high altitude, who had seen near misses swallowed by the ocean, began to question the old methods. They started experimenting, flying lower, tightened bomb patterns and sharpened accuracy. That much became clear. But dropping down also meant something else entirely. It meant meeting the enemy at eye level. It meant seeing faces on decks instead of silhouettes from 10,000 feet. One of the central figures in that evolution was Paul the First Gun, a Navy aviator and gifted aviation tinkerer attached to Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific. Gun and others like him stood something simple and brutally practical. Japanese transports and merchant ships were not heavily armored warships. Their bridges were exposed. Their anti-aircraft crews stood in open mounts. Deck equipment, fuel drums, communication lines, all of it sat vulnerable to direct concentrated fire. If those positions could be smashed before the bombs ever left the aircraft, the odds shifted. The bomber's chances of surviving the run improved. Its chances of doing real damage rose with them. The solution they devised was bold, some would say reckless. Remove the glass bombardier's nose. Strip away the transparent front that symbolized precision bombing. In its place, bolt on a solid nose packed with forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Instead of relying solely on gravity to do the work, the aircraft would now hurl a storm of metal straight ahead as it closed on its target. Field modifications came quickly. 6 fixed guns became 8 in certain variants. Additional side-mounted gun packages added even more bite. When the pilot squeezed the trigger and all guns fired together, the tracers merged into what looked like a single, unbroken streamer, blazing lance of steel, driving toward the ship ahead. The tactical shift matched the physical overhaul. B-25 crews trained to come in at mast height, sometimes skimming only a few dozen feet above the waves. They approached fast, very fast. Guns opened up at ranges so short that enemy gunners had barely seconds to react. The heavy .50 caliber rounds tore into bridges, shredded exposed gun crews, and swept decks clear of resistance. Then came the bombs. Released low in a technique that came to be called skip bombing, they struck the water and ricocheted forward, skipping across the surface like flat stones. Still they slammed into a ship's hull and detonated. It demanded nerve of a rare kind. Flying that low invited intense small arms, fire, and bursts of shrapnel. Engines thundered just above salt spray. A moment's misjudgment, a slight dip of a wing, a mistimed pull-up, and the bomber could cartwheel into the sea. There was no margin for complacency, and yet the results were undeniable. Ships that once evaded destruction through sharp maneuvering now found themselves pummeled at close range. Strafing runs tore apart defensive crews before they could mount effective resistance. Direct hits followed. Japanese sailors, trained to look skyward for diving silhouettes or watch for torpedo wakes, suddenly faced aircraft charging straight at them, guns blazing without pause. The 8-gun nose changed the B-25's character entirely. It was no longer simply a medium bomber dropping payloads from altitude. It had become something more aggressive, part bomber, part gunship, built for assault. Pilots spoke of the strange mix of terror and control they felt during those head-on runs. You were exposed, undeniably so, but you were also dictating the fight. For crews on Japanese decks, the experience was jarring. There was no elegant dive, no single torpedo slicing through water. There was only a relentless wall of fire advancing straight toward them. Out of battlefield necessity, out of frustration, improvisation, and hard-earned experience, the B-25 had been reborn. It was no longer merely adaptable. It had become a weapon shaped specifically for the Pacific's unforgiving demands. And before long, it would demonstrate just how devastating that transformation could be in one defining engagement that would echo across the theater. In March of 1943, Japanese commanders assembled what they believed would be a routine reinforcement convoy bound for New Guinea. Their troops there were under pressure, battered, and in need of men, ammunition, food, everything that keeps an army standing. So they organized multiple transports, heavily loaded with soldiers and critical supplies, and assigned destroyers to escort them. On paper, it was a standard operation. Convoys had crossed those waters before. But this time, they were being watched. Allied intelligence picked up the movement. Word moved quickly through American air commands in the Southwest Pacific. Plans were drawn. Briefings were held over maps stained with sweat and cigarette ash. Crews listened carefully. They knew this could be the proving ground for everything they had been refining. The stage was set for what would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. At first, weather offered the convoy a measure of protection. Heavy clouds and squalls masked its progress, buying precious time. But the Pacific has a way of revealing what it hides. Once the ships were located, the attacks began. They did not let up. High-level bombers arrived first. They came in from altitude, dropping their loads, forcing Japanese gunners to look skyward and scatter their fire. It was distraction, pressure, chaos from above. And then, cutting in low, beneath that confusion, came the modified B-25s. They flew at wave-top height. So low, their propellers seemed to churn the sea. Approaching from different directions, they converged on the convoy with engines straining and 8 forward-firing guns already flashing. The air in front of them filled with tracer fire. Japanese anti-aircraft crews tried to respond. They swung their guns downward, searching for angles, but the intensity of the strafing runs was overwhelming. 50 caliber rounds smashed into bridges, shredded communication lines, and tore through exposed gun crews before organized resistance could take hold. Decks that had been orderly moments before dissolved into smoke and splintered steel. As the B-25s thundered past their targets, they released their bombs low. The munitions struck the water, skipped forward across the surface, and slammed into hulls with brutal precision. Explosions erupted along the sides of transports crammed with troops. Fire climbed into the sky. Ships began to slow, to list, to burn. The assault stretched over hours. It was not a single strike, but a sustained hammering. One ship after another took hits. Some were left dead in the water, flames consuming their decks. Others rolled heavily before slipping beneath the surface. Destroyers that moved in to rescue survivors found themselves attacked in turn. Coordination between strafing runs and skip bombing proved devastatingly effective, each element reinforcing the other. By the time it was over, 8 transports and 4 destroyers lay sunk. Thousands of Japanese soldiers never reached New Guinea. They perished in smoke and oil-streaked water, casualties of a tactic that had come of age. The meaning of the battle went far beyond the tally of ships destroyed. It settled an argument. Low-level strafing, combined with skip bombing, was no longer an experiment born of desperation. It was a decisive method of warfare. The losses in the Bismarck Sea crippled Japan's ability to reinforce its positions in New Guinea and marked a turning point in how Allied air power would be applied across the Pacific. For the B-25 crews, the battle was confirmation. Months of field modifications, trial runs, and dangerous practice approaches had paid off. They had taken a conventional medium bomber and reshaped it into a weapon capable of dismantling entire convoys. For Japan, the lesson was stark. The waters that had once carried expansion and momentum now became corridors of peril. And from that point forward, the 8-gun B-25 was no longer viewed as an improvisation born in jungle airstrips. It was recognized for what it had become, a proven ship killer that had shifted the tactical balance in the Southwest Pacific. Japanese naval doctrine had long been built around certain expectations. Dive bombers coming from above, torpedo aircraft skimming the water. Those were the threats every shipboard gun crew trained to meet. Anti-aircraft emplacements were arranged to counter steep dives or flanking torpedo runs. Everything was calculated for those scenarios. But the medium bomber charging straight at mast height with a torrent of frontal fire, that was something entirely outside the playbook. The models, the drills, the defensive thinking, it didn't account for it. The most vulnerable targets were the merchant ships and transports carrying the bulk of Japan's supplies. Unlike battleships, their bridges and gun positions were lightly protected, their crews exposed in the open. When a B-25 came in close, guns blazing, the effect was immediate. Suppression was swift and often brutal. leaving the decks silent except for splintering wood and ricocheting steel. The psychological effect was as significant as the physical damage. Sailors would later describe aircraft that seemed unwilling to pull up, that hurtled straight toward them through bursts of flak and tracer fire. The sudden eruption of .50 caliber rounds across the decks created confusion, even panic. Command structures and communications could be shredded in a single pass. Even if a ship survived the initial approach, coordination collapsed, leaving crews struggling to respond. The situation was worsened by another factor: the declining presence of Japanese air cover in key regions. As Allied forces gained air superiority, convoys often sailed with minimal fighter protection. Radar coverage was uneven and incomplete. By the time lookouts spotted incoming aircraft, low-level attackers were already seconds away from impact. Japan tried to adapt. Convoy formations were adjusted. Additional anti-aircraft guns were mounted. Procedures revised. But the combination of head-on strafing and skip bombing had revealed a systemic vulnerability. The Empire's sprawling maritime lifelines, considered nearly impregnable, were far more fragile than anyone had realized. After proving itself in battles like the Bismarck Sea, the B-25 continued to evolve in remarkable ways. Later versions carried even more forward-firing guns, some outfitted with as many as 14 and side-mounted packages, expanded their strafing arcs. The aircraft had grown into a versatile multi-role attack platform, capable of striking ships, supporting troops on the ground, and pounding enemy positions with precision. But its legacy went far beyond specifications or numbers. The transformation of the B-25 was a vivid demonstration of how battlefield necessity drives innovation. Crews and engineers alike adapted on the fly, reshaping doctrine and tactics in real time. What began as an improvisation in jungle airstrips evolved into a model that would influence the development of armed gunships and low-level attack aircraft for decades to come. In the wider sweep of the Pacific War, the strafing B-25 became a symbol of Allied adaptability. Japan had seized the early momentum with bold, coordinated strikes, but the Allies responded with ingenuity of their own. The 8-gun Nosor, the later 14-gun variants, was more than metal and firepower. It was a testament to the idea that tactical flexibility could reshape strategic outcomes. By the war's end, the B-25 had earned a reputation as one of the most versatile aircraft of World War II. From lifting off a carrier deck during the daring Doolittle raid to hurtling at wavetop height during assaults in the Bismarck Sea, it proved that an aircraft's design did not define its destiny. On the battlefield, imagination, courage, and adaptation often mattered more than blueprints. And in the vast expanse of the Pacific, that willingness to rethink a machine's purpose transformed a conventional medium bomber into a weapon capable of dismantling convoys one searing, thunderous, strafing run at a time. As the war in the Pacific pressed ever closer to Japan's doorstep, the strafer B-25 became more than a single aircraft or a clever tacticate became a symbol. What had started as a practical twin-engine medium bomber had, through urgency, frustration, and relentless frontline ingenuity, evolved into one of the most feared anti-shipping weapons in the theater. The roar of its engines at mast height, the blinding flash of 8 forward-firing .50 caliber guns, the violent chain reaction of explosions along a convoy's deckstees were no longer extraordinary events. They were the new reality at sea. For Japan, the lesson was harsh and unavoidable. An empire built on maritime expansion depended entirely on fragile supply lines stretching across thousands of miles of open ocean. Every soldier sent to a distant island, every gallon of fuel, every crate of ammunition had to travel by ship. And now, those ships faced an enemy that refused to follow predictable rules. The modified North American B-25 Mitchell didn't circle from altitude, waiting for ideal conditions. It didn't swoop in a textbook dive. It came straight, silencing gun crews and hammering hulls with skip bombs that struck at point-blank range. But the true significance of the 8-gun nose wasn't measured only in tons of steel sunk or convoys shattered. It was proof of adaptability under pressure. In the wake of early setbacks after Pearl Harbor, American forces in the Pacific had been forced to improvise. Resources were scarce. Airfields were rough, carved from coral and mud. The enemy seemed unstoppable. Yet within those constraints, aircrews and mechanics reimagined what they had. They removed the glass nose, bolted in more guns, refined low-level attack techniques, and transformed a conventional bomber into a precision instrument of maritime destruction. The Strafer B-25 also underscored a broader truth about modern warfare. Technology alone doesn't decide outcomes. Doctrine, imagination, and the courage to challenge assumptions can matter just as much as armor or fleet size. Japanese defenses had been built to counter expected threats: high-level bombers, dive attacks, torpedoes. They were not ready for a medium bomber that charged directly into defensive fire, unleashing a sustained storm of bullets before delivering its bombs. That gap between expectation and reality proved deadly. By the time Allied forces pushed deeper into the Pacific, the Strafer's legacy was undeniable. Convoys sailed with tighter formations, escorts on high alert, but the vulnerability remained. The seas that had once enabled expansion now carried constant peril. And for the men flying those low-level attacks, every mission demanded extraordinary nerve. They skimmed the waves under fire, trusting their engines, their aim, and one another. In the end, the story of the 8-gun B-25 is not just about metal and ordnance, it is about transformation. A machine built for one purpose became something entirely different when circumstances demanded it. In doing so, it helped tilt the balance of power in a vast ocean war. And across the Pacific, long after the tracers faded and the smoke cleared, the memory endured of a bomber that did not simply drop destruction from above, but came in at eye level and tore ships apart with fire.